On December 20th, 2024, the Federal Reserve released a set of numbers that, to the untrained eye, looked like mere statistical noise in a busy holiday season. The M2 money supply stood at $21.2 trillion. To understand the gravity of that figure, we have to look back just 5 years. In January 2020, before the global economy ground to a halt, that number was $15.4 trillion. In less than 60 months, the United States has engineered a $5.8 trillion expansion of its currency. This is not merely a policy adjustment. It is a structural tectonic shift. To put this in a historical perspective that reveals the sheer scale of our current trajectory, the entire U.S. money supply in 1980 was only $1.6 trillion. We have effectively manufactured 3.5 times the entire 1980 economy in a single 5-year window. Most economic commentary focuses on the immediate fluctuations of the consumer price index or the quarterly adjustments of interest rates, but these are lagging indicators of a much deeper, more predatory mechanism. What we witnessed between 2021 and 2023 was not the climax of inflation, but a mere preliminary tremor. Money does not saturate the global infrastructure instantaneously. It moves through the system in calculated, systemic waves that first inflate assets, then consume purchasing power, and finally terminate in the structural liquidation of the middle class. If you find yourself questioning why the traditional metrics of success no longer seem to apply to the modern world, it is because you're looking at the surface while the foundation is being re-engineered. This channel is dedicated to dissecting these invisible architectures of wealth and control. If you value an investigation that prioritizes structural data over emotional narrative, I invite you to subscribe. Your engagement through likes and comments ensures that this data-driven perspective continues to reach those who need to see the machinery before it resets. In this investigation, we're going to move past the headlines to calculate why a $90 trillion inflationary event is now a mathematical certainty. We will explore the 4 stages of currency collapse that have remained unchanged for 2 millennia and identify the specific mechanism that will transfer the remaining wealth of the middle class to a centralized elite. Stay with us until the final chapter, where we will reveal the precise data point that signals the transition from stage 3 to the final reset. The fundamental thesis of our investigation is that inflation is not a failure of the system, but a requirement for its continued survival. In a debt-based monetary framework, the total amount of debt always exceeds the total amount of currency in circulation because of the interest component. This creates a permanent, structural deficit that can only be managed through the continuous expansion of the money supply. When the debt reaches a critical mass, as it has now with the U.S. national debt exceeding $34 trillion, the interest expense alone becomes a primary driver of new money creation. This is the debt inflation spiral. We are currently observing the transition from a policy-driven economy to one of fiscal dominance, where the central bank is no longer fighting inflation, but is instead forced to monetize the debt to prevent a sovereign default. This framework dictates that the middle class must be the primary source of liquidity for this transition. Through the Cantillon effect, the newly created money benefits those closest to the source, banks and government contractors, while the purchasing power of the average citizen is diluted to service the interest on a debt they did not directly accrue. This is the inevitable architecture of debasement. To understand why a $90 trillion inflationary wave is inevitable, we must first examine the original blueprint of systemic collapse provided by the Roman Empire. In the early days of the Republic, under Emperor Augustus, the silver denarius was a pillar of stability, composed of roughly 95% pure silver. It was a hard currency that facilitated the expansion of trade and the growth of a robust merchant middle class. However, as the empire expanded, so did its administrative and military costs. By the reign of Emperor Nero, the state faced a structural deficit that it could not cover through traditional taxation alone. Rather than reducing expenditures or admitting insolvency, the Roman state began the process of debasement, reducing the silver content of the denarius to 80%. This was the first historical instance of a state using the currency as a stealth tax on its citizens. For the next 2 centuries, the purity of the denarius continued to plummet in a direct correlation with the empire's rising debt. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, the silver content had dropped to a staggering 0.5%, essentially a copper coin washed in a thin layer of silver that quickly wore off. The systemic implications of this debasement were catastrophic and mirrored exactly what we are seeing in the modern M2 supply expansion. As the intrinsic value of the currency vanished, prices for basic commodities exploded. A loaf of wheat that once cost 100 denarii eventually reached a price of 100,000 denarii. The Roman middle class, the legionaries, small landholders, and urban merchants, found their lifetime savings liquidated by the state's need to fund its bureaucracy. This led to the 3rd century crisis, where the social contract was effectively shredded. Emperor Diocletian attempted to halt the inevitable with the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, which established strict price controls under penalty of death. It failed because it ignored the fundamental plumbing of the economy. Merchants refused to sell goods at a loss, leading to a complete breakdown of the urban supply chain. The resulting ruralization saw the middle class flee to the country estates of the wealthy elite, trading their freedom for food and security. This transition from a merchant-based economy to a feudalistic structure is the ultimate endpoint of currency debasement. It is the process of turning a population of owners into a population of serfs, a mechanism that is currently being replicated through the erosion of modern purchasing power. While the Romans used copper and fire, the modern state uses the digital plumbing of the Federal Reserve and the shadow banking system to achieve the same result. The current expansion of the money supply, from 15.4 trillion in 2020 to over 21 trillion in 2024, represents a 38% increase in the total currency in circulation. To understand the operational detail of this expansion, we must look at how money enters the system. When a U.S. Treasury issues new debt to fund its trillion-dollar deficits, it relies on primary dealers to purchase these bonds. However, when the appetite for this debt wanes, the Federal Reserve steps in as the buyer of last resort, creating new digital dollars to purchase these bonds and add them to its balance sheet. This process, often sanitized as quantitative easing, is the modern equivalent of Nero adding copper to the silver melt. This new money does not enter the economy equally. It follows the path of the Cantillon effect, which dictates that those closest to the source of money creation, large financial institutions and government contractors, receive the new currency before it has had the chance to drive up prices. This creates a systemic redistribution of wealth that is invisible to the average observer. By the time the $5.8 trillion created since 2020 reached the general public, the price of real assets like housing and stocks had already been bid up by the initial recipients of the liquidity. Since 2020, housing prices have surged by approximately 47%, while the S&P 500 has expanded by 60%. The middle class, who primarily earn wages and hold their savings in currency or low-yield accounts, find themselves in a mathematical trap. Their cost of living, reflected in the second wave of consumer price inflation, rises faster than their ability to accumulate capital. This is the interest rate trap. As the national debt grows to $34.5 trillion, the interest expense alone is projected to exceed $1.1 trillion per year. This interest cannot be paid through taxation without collapsing the economy, meaning it must be paid through further money creation. We are now in a self-reinforcing feedback loop where the debt requires more printing, and the printing creates more debt, ensuring that the $90 trillion inflationary wave is a structural certainty rather than a possibility. To see the final acceleration of this mechanism, we must analyze the collapse of the German Papiermark in 1923. The Weimar Republic provides the most extreme example of what happens when the trust stage of a currency is permanently broken. Before World War I, The German mark traded at 4.2 to the US dollar. By the end of 1923, after years of the government printing money to pay war reparations and social obligations, the exchange rate reached an incomprehensible 4.2 trillion marks to a single dollar. This was not a linear decline, but an exponential explosion driven by the velocity of money. In the early stages of inflation, people hold onto their money, hoping prices will return to normal. This is the stage the United States occupied between 2021 and 2023. However, once the public realizes that the debasement is a permanent structural feature of the system, the psychology shifts. People begin to spend their currency as quickly as they receive it, trading it for any real asset, food, fuel, or hard goods, before it loses more value. This shift in velocity is what causes the final destruction of the middle class. In Weimar Germany, the professional class, who had spent decades saving marks in bank accounts and insurance policies, saw their entire life's work reduced to the price of a loaf of bread in a matter of months. Meanwhile, those who had access to debt and hard assets, the industrial elites, were able to buy up entire city blocks for the equivalent of a few hundred pre-war dollars. This is the transfer of wealth stage. The $90 trillion in coming inflation is not just a number. It is the total value of unfunded liabilities and global debt that the current system is mathematically incapable of paying back in honest currency. Just as in 1923, the system will choose to default through inflation rather than a hard bankruptcy. This allows the state to maintain its nominal obligations while effectively wiping out the value of the debt, and the savings of the middle class along with it. The acceleration we are witnessing today, with global debt to GDP at 330%, suggests we are approaching the psychological tipping point where the velocity of money begins its terminal climb. To understand why the current inflationary trajectory is mathematically locked in, we must examine the concept of fiscal dominance. For decades, the Federal Reserve operated under the illusion of independence, using interest rates as a primary tool to balance employment and inflation. However, that era ended when the U.S. national debt surpassed the $34 trillion mark. We are now entering a phase where monetary policy is no longer dictated by economic health, but by the desperate need to keep the sovereign government solvent. With an annual deficit running at approximately $1.7 trillion and a total debt-to-tax revenue ratio exceeding 800%, the math has become inescapable. If interest rates remain at levels necessary to fight inflation, the interest expense on the national debt, now exceeding $1.1 trillion per year, will consume the entire federal budget. This forces the central bank into a corner where it must choose between a catastrophic sovereign default or the intentional debasement of the currency. History shows that every empire, without exception, chooses the latter. This is the interest rate trap in its most lethal form. When a treasury can no longer fund its obligations through taxes or the sale of bonds to private investors, the Federal Reserve is forced to step in and monetize the debt. This creates a permanent floor for the money supply expansion. We are no longer looking at a temporary stimulus in response to a crisis. We are looking at a structural requirement to print money just to pay the interest on money that was printed previously. This creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop that accelerates the debasement process. As the Fed's balance sheet expands toward its previous $9 trillion peak and beyond, the fundamental value of the dollar is sacrificed to maintain the nominal functioning of the state. This is fiscal dominance, a state where the central bank becomes a mere subsidiary of the Treasury, and the currency becomes a tool for debt liquidation rather than a store of value for the citizenry. The $90 trillion inflationary wave does not hit everyone at the same time or with the same force. This is due to the Cantillon effect, a structural phenomenon named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon. It describes how the point of entry for new money determines who gets richer and who gets poorer. When the Federal Reserve creates new digital dollars, that liquidity enters the system through the primary dealers, the massive global banks and financial institutions that sit at the top of the hierarchy. These institutions receive the new money first, before it has had time to circulate through the wider economy and drive up the prices of goods and services. They use this capital to purchase real assets, stocks, real estate, and commodities at current prices. By the time this money trickles down to the middle-class worker in the form of wages or social spending, the prices of the assets they need to buy have already been inflated by the initial wave of liquidity. This explains why, since 2020, we have seen a 60% expansion in the S&P 500 and a 47% increase in housing prices despite a global economic slowdown. The shadow banking system, with a notional value estimated at $600 trillion, acts as a massive reservoir for this liquidity, keeping it within the asset markets and away from the consumer price index for as long as possible. This creates a wealth effect for the top 0.1%, who own the majority of these assets, while effectively pricing the middle class out of the American dream. The middle class is forced to compete for a shrinking pool of real assets using currency that is losing value every second. This is not a side effect of the system. It is the system's primary mechanism for redistributing wealth from the productive economy to the financial elite without the need for a single vote or a change in tax law. The final stage of a $90 trillion crisis is the total liquidation of middle-class ownership. We are currently witnessing the transition from an ownership-based economy to a subscription-based, rentier economy. This is the inevitable conclusion of a system where the median home price to median income ratio has soared to 7.5 times, making traditional property ownership a mathematical impossibility for the next generation. As purchasing power evaporates, the middle class is forced to liquidate their savings and sell their assets to the very institutions that received the Cantillon liquidity first. This is why we see institutional investors purchasing thousands of single-family homes across the country. They're trading debased currency for real, hard assets that will retain value after the reset. The $210 trillion in unfunded liabilities, the promises the state has made for pensions and health care, cannot be paid in real value. They will be paid in nominal dollars that buy progressively less, effectively defaulting on the social contract through the back door of inflation. This wealth transfer is the mechanism that bridges the gap between the current debt-based system and the inevitable reset. By destroying the savings of the middle class, the system eliminates its internal debt obligations. If you owe $1 million but inflation makes $1 million the price of coffee, your debt has been effectively wiped out, but so has the value of the labor of the person who lent you that money. This is the great leveling that precedes every major monetary transition. The top 0.1%, who hold their wealth in land, intellectual property, and industrial infrastructure, will emerge from the $90 trillion wave with their power intact. The middle class, who relied on the stability of the currency and the integrity of the system, will find themselves at stage 4 of the collapse, the reset. At this point, a new system will be introduced, likely a centralized digital architecture, that will formalize the new reality, a world where you own nothing and the state manages the remaining crumbs of productivity. The convergence of fiscal dominance, the Cantillon effect, and the historical precedents of Rome and Weimar leads us to a singular mathematical conclusion. The $90 trillion inflationary wave is not a localized event, but a global systemic reset. This $90 trillion figure represents the total weight of sovereign debt, private credit bubbles, and the staggering $210 trillion in unfunded liabilities that the Western financial architecture has promised to its citizens. In a world where global debt to GDP stands at 330%, there is no longer a path back to sound money through traditional austerity or growth. To pay back these obligations in currency with the same purchasing power as when the debt was issued would require a level of productivity that the modern world simply cannot generate. Therefore, the system must choose the only path that preserves the nominal structure of the state while liquidating its real-world obligations, the permanent expansion of the M2 money supply. This is the process of a controlled demolition of the currency's value. The mechanism is now operating at a velocity that far exceeds the public's ability to adapt. As we observed with the $5.8 trillion created in less than 5 years, the waves of inflation are compressing. The first wave of asset inflation is already complete, having priced a generation out of the housing market. The second wave of consumer prices has already eroded the disposable income of the working class. We are now entering the third wave, the structural liquidation of middle-class wealth. This is the stage where the interest rate trap forces the central bank to choose between saving the currency or saving the government. By choosing to monetize the debt, the Federal Reserve ensures that the $90 trillion in global liabilities will be paid, but the currency used to pay them will have no relation to the labor once used to earn it. This is the ultimate invisible tax. It is a systemic transfer of wealth that allows the elite to retain ownership of the infrastructure, land, energy, and technology, while the population is left with a digital currency that is programmed to lose value by design. This is not a conspiracy, but the logical endpoint of the debt inflation spiral that began when we abandoned the discipline of hard assets. As we have demonstrated, the current trajectory of the global monetary system is dictated by a set of mathematical inevitabilities that no policy adjustment can fully reverse. We are moving toward a final reset, stage 4 of the currency collapse, where the old debt-based architecture will be replaced by a new, likely more centralized, digital framework. The transition will be characterized by the $90 trillion inflationary wave we have analyzed today, a period of profound volatility that will serve as the final filter for middle-class wealth. History teaches us that in times of systemic debasement, those who hold their wealth in the plumbing of the state, the currency and its related debt instruments, are the ones who bear the cost of the reset. Conversely, those who understand the structural nature of this transition and position themselves in real assets and infrastructure are the ones who survive to the next cycle. The numbers do not lie, and the precedents are clear. The system will always prioritize its own survival over the purchasing power of its citizens. This investigation into the underlying mechanisms of our economy is part of our ongoing effort to map the invisible structures of power and wealth. If you found this data-driven analysis valuable and wish to stay informed on the structural shifts that define our modern world, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support allows us to continue producing deep-dive investigations that look beneath the surface of the headlines to reveal the machinery of the global economy. By sharing this video, you help others understand the why behind the numbers, providing a clear-eyed perspective in an era of manufactured noise. We will continue to track the M2 supply expansion and the velocity of this transition in our future reports. Thank you for your time and for being part of this community of observers. Until the next video, see you in the next video.